together. So thank you everyone for coming for our
Presentation right
our global talk this morning. It's with great pleasure that I introduce Atefeh Zargarzadeh. She's a PhD candidate here at the University of Victoria in the Theatre Studies program. She's working on a doctoral dissertation that examines nuanced narratives of dislocation and identity negotiation among lesser recognized Middle Eastern immigrant communities and theatre artists in the diaspora. She's here as a CFGS fellow, and she's also a member of the 2026 Local Arrangements Committee for the Canadian Association for Theatre Research. So she's going to take a little bit longer than normal today because of the nature of her talk. And then we're going to be very good in our Q&A to get as many questions in with the time that remains. Yeah. Well, don't be so fast we don't follow you.
Okay.
Yeah. Make it loud. Your audience, yeah, find the balance.
Yeah.
So not sure how you're located in terms of being able to see people around the table, but you'll figure.
I'm gonna maybe change on that.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Atty.
Thanks so much for this nice intro.
Oh, and my question, I forgot to start with land acknowledgement. I went through that so quickly. Back up. Yeah, one. As normally, we would like to acknowledge with respect Lekwungen and Songhees peoples whose territory the university stands, the Lekwungen being the Saanich and the Esquimalt, and the Songhees, and then the Wasanich peoples whose traditional relationship with lands continues to this day. So yes, again, my apologies. I've got a lot on plate this week. So please.
Thank you so much for the great intro. Good morning, everyone. It's so much for being here. I don't know if I can and thank you to Center for Global Studies for recognizing and supporting my my research and for giving me this space actually to present my research.
You can speak a little bit louder because I'm
sure.
older and
Absolutely, yeah.
Sorry to bother.
No worries.
Maybe I'll come over there.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No,
Thank you for the space presented and think through it with you. It's a great opportunity for me. I'm Atefeh, I'm Iranian, and I'm also an immigrant living and working on this land. The traditional territory of the Lekwungen peoples. I wanted to personally acknowledge and honor the enduring relationships of the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples with this land. I also want to take a moment to honor my Iranian community who are always in my thoughts, and especially now, my heart is with all the innocent civilians who have lost loved ones, not only over the past 40 days, but also in the 2-day massacre in early January, and also across all these 7 years of ongoing the struggle against systemic violence, oppression, and displacement imposed both from within and beyond borders in the pursuit of freedom and a life of dignity. To stay alive, safe, free, and even connected to the world, these are privileges that I hold and acknowledge with humility, knowing from lived experience that for many communities, including my own, they are not actually simply given, they are fought for every single day. My research begins and comes from this very point of in-betweenness, and it has been informed and shaped by lived experience. My lived experience is both Iranian and immigrant. Sorry. Okay. This project comes from a very personal place for me. I came to Canada as an immigrant 8 years ago, and at one point as a temporary resident and as an international grad student in theater studies. Very quickly, ideas that had been once felt abstract to me, exile, identity, and belonging, became lived realities through language, paperwork, institutions, and difficult work of rebuilding a life. Opportunities were many, and I've been so grateful to each and every one of them. But always in the presence of ongoing struggle for survival, visibility, and authenticity. Being Iranian and from the Middle East has also meant becoming more aware of how identity gets misread, and placed into categories that do not necessarily, that do not always fit. And over time, and especially through my own shift from temporary to permanent status, I came to understand that belonging is not only emotional, but also institutional. And that is what led me to this research. I became interested in how immigrant artists from my own community or the region that I come from rebuild professional lives, become visible within new systems, and negotiate the gap between who they already were before migration and how they are newly understood here. And within this process, I came across some of the less recognized immigrant theater artists from various communities in the Middle East, and I felt there was an important gap in the conversation. We already have a scholarship on more established exilic figures and companies that have secured a visible space in the theater market, but little is known about the nuanced narratives of some of these artists who are still navigating a more precarious and transitional phase. Artists who have moved to Canada within the past decade, particularly in my research, and may have deep histories in their home countries, yet still have to rebuild legitimacy networks and access almost from the ground up in Canada. And looking at those cases help us see the institutional and material pressures of migration a bit more clearly and from the viewpoint of the less heard. It also helps us move away from overly polished success narratives or success stories and toward a more grounded account of what artistic reentry actually requires. So here's the overview of how I'm going to approach this talk today. I'm not going to talk a lot about it, just to save some time. So this talk comes out of a larger context, which is my dissertation, doctoral dissertation, which looks at less recognized Middle Eastern immigrant theater artists and companies based and working across 3 different cities, Toronto, Calgary, and Vancouver, and across both physical and digital performance spaces. Currently, I'm working on the first chapter, which is actually the topic of this talk. Each chapter is a case study looking at these artists and companies, and sometimes in comparison, regarding the politics of emergence for the first one, identity representation and strategies for the second chapter, and intercultural exchange on a stage and within digital venues for the third chapter. My thesis looks at 4 theater companies as case studies, all founded within the past decade in Canada by less represented artists from the Middle East. We have Nowadays Theatre, founded by Mohamed Yagoubi, Aida Kekhai, both Iranian Canadian artists based in Toronto. I have Ahmed Monica, founder of Tria Theatre, based in Toronto. Is a very talented Iraqi Canadian artist that I had the honor to meet. Also, I have Qualis Act, founded by Suleiman Al-Dib, a Syrian Canadian artist based in Calgary, and this amazing theater company, Blackout Theatre, based in Vancouver, founded by Amir Hosseini and Soham Samajou, 2 Iranian Canadian artists. And as I said, each chapter actually speaks to some of the challenges and opportunities that these artists actually are facing as they are rebuilding their professional trajectories here in Canada. And as I said, today's talk is based on Nowadays Theatre, Mohammed and Aida. And the case is part of a broader comparative project. It is where I ask what happens when artists who were already established elsewhere enter the Canadian field and received as emerging. The main question I asked with my dissertation is how less recognized exilic, Middle East, and theater artists in Canada navigate institutional power, identity representation and communication, access to resources, and artistic survival. The key questions I follow in this in the first chapter and in this talk are what happens to prior experience after migration, and how is legitimacy rebuilt in a new field, and how are visibility, funding, and institutional recognition shaped. So even though the chapter is grounded in one case study, nowadays theater, the larger concern is about how immigrant artists, less recognized ones, how their artistic trajectories are reorganized within a particular institutional and market environment, which is called Canada's professional theater market. Some of the keywords that I would like to talk about here is, let's start with exilic immigrant on bottom. I use exile and immigrant in overlapping ways in my study. While I acknowledge their different degrees of choice and force, I use exile as not only a term to address loss and displacement only, but also a condition that can generate new ways of making and surviving and creating a potential that cannot totally free artists from linguistic, cultural, or institutional pressures either. So here, the exilic condition carries both vulnerability and agency. Artistic reentry is another term, is important because these artists are not entering the market for the first time. They are re-entering professional life under changed conditions. And emergence is another key term that I treated critically, for it is not always just an early career stage. Sometimes emergence or being emerging is produced institutionally. And finally, we have the term capital and different kinds of capital that I derive from Bourdieu's theories. They help me ask not only what artists bring with them, but whether those resources can actually be recognized and used in the new field. Interculturalism is another central term, or better to say context, in my work, where I situate my argument. Again, I use it critically, not simply as a hybrid space of encounter, transformation, exchange. Yes, it is true that this is it's that kind of a space. But as a space structured by unequal, power relations, structured by unequal access, selective recognition, and power asymmetry around who gets to move freely across cultural forms and who remains more tightly controlled or explained. Part of the literature I reviewed was filled with debates on interculturalism across these two extremes. My view of interculturalism sits somewhere between where Yana Mirzan and Loan Gilbert and Rick Moles and some other scholars actually are also discussing it in a liminal space between the two sides. I use the term in a more critical than celebratory sense, as a space of possibility that cannot be entirely outside power. My main theoretical framework for this research comes from Bourdieu. He helps me think about Canada's theater market as a field, a structured space with its own rules, hierarchies, and its struggles over legitimacy. His understanding of capital as the resource people hold and mobilize within a social field, resources whose value depends on whether that field recognizes them as legitimate, helps me ask what kinds of capital immigrant artists bring with them, whether that capital can be converted in the host field, and how that process or how those processes depend on symbolic power and on proximity to institutions. I also draw on Baba's idea of liminality and in-betweenness to think about the liminality of the exilic condition itself and the liminality of interculturalism or intercultural spaces that both shape the processes of artistic creation for those artists. And that in-betweenness is not only symbolic, it's lived through translation, negotiation, and the pressure to remain intelligible across different systems. Foucault's theories on power relations and power basically help me read power as dispersed, relational, and everyday, something that is everywhere, working through institutional routines in processes that are also generating points of resistance in themselves. And although those points of resistance can be like transitory or minimal or small. And speaking of power, one important source among many that in particular informed part of my argument was this research by Marisol Dandria. I had to be selective of the articles, and this is the most important one. It's about symbolic power and arts funding in Canada. Canadian arts councils make funding decisions through a peer review model that operates at arm's length distance from government agencies. In theory, government sets the mandate and budget of an arts council, while councils decide what and whom to fund without direct political interference. Through extensive fieldwork, this particular research, among many, actually show that this peer review model does not always award funding based solely on artistic merit, and that funding decisions can involve tensions among councils, jurors, government priorities, tensions between arts councils priorities and those of the arts community, that in Foucault's word, while not entirely independent of the symbolic power, have their own transitory moments of resistance against it as well. And that tension is worth looking at, especially in the context of Canada's theatre market, as a form of pyramidal structure that Alan Filewood actually depicts really well in his research that I actually mentioned at the bottom. See how resources, these are like different places that different forms of theater companies can sit. The most institutional one, the fringe and self-subsidized companies, and see how resources into institutional recognition and economic integration concentrate towards the top as we go up, and delivery, diversity, experimentation, and financial precarity actually concentrates on the bottom as we go downward. And this is important for my project because many less recognized exotic and intercultural companies sit within that area, between somehow subsidized or self-subsidized. I don't know. This is a kind of precarious area that they sit, and and uh, these companies, these precarious spaces where creativity may flourish, but institutional support remains uneven. And depending on the capital they convert, they bring with them, or how they are subsidized, they will flow in this area that I indicated, and spaces that have one thing in common. All these spaces, these little ones, not little, but large ones. One thing that they have in common is the permanent state of financial emergency. So in the context of those tensions within the arts funding resources and within the pyramidal structure of professional theatre market in Canada, my argument in this research is certain less recognized immigrant artists arriving in this uneven intercultural market may be repositioned as emerging, not because they lack prior experience, but because their established histories they bring from their homelands are not immediately legible within local institutions. And in this sense, belonging is not only symbolic or emotional, it is also administratively produced. It depends on the system that determine who counts as professional, which trajectories are recognized, and what work becomes fundable, presentable, and institutionally feasible. And from this perspective, emergence or being emerging becomes more than a career stage. for many of these artists. It can function as an administrative effect shaped by funding structures, eligibility criteria, policy structures, and professional norms inherent in the theater market. And the method I carried out in this research was oral history interviews. I interviewed these artists, and I had to travel to these three main cities, Calgary, Toronto, and Vancouver, with the great help of CFGS, of course. I really want to acknowledge that it wasn't actually possible to do that field work in those three cities and stay there and talk to these artists. Plus library research, and I spoke for this particular research. I can mention that I spoke with one of the co-founders of Nowadays Theatre, Mohammad Yagoubi, and the review of artists and companies' histories, companies' materials, published interviews, besides policy documents, strategic plans, census-based reports, and art sector surveys. I used mixed sources because I'm not trying to tell either a purely personal narrative or a story, or a purely abstract institutional story. I want to read lived experience besides the broader structures that shape it. And it was really important to me to actually bring the perspective of those research participants to my research through fieldwork, through direct connection. And I wanted this to be more of a synthesis, placing oral history in conversation with policy, data, and theory. Briefly speaking of some of the materials I reviewed that I put like there, this is the list of some of the institutional materials that I reviewed. I particularly came across data on immigrant community and creative workers, showing that no matter where you come from and what major city you settle in, rebuilding an artistic career here in Canada often depends on access to mentorship, networks, grants, and practical knowledge of how the field works locally. But at the same time, many reports I reviewed suggest that immigrant artists, particularly often, in particular, I mean, like many artists, but particularly immigrant ones, often face recurring barriers. Their prior experience may not be recognized. The field is precarious, and institutional and cultural expectations can shape what kinds of work become possible. And many of the racialized artists, in particular, also reported facing racism, stereotyping, and increasing demand for that Canadian experience that is not easy to get, especially as an immigrant. With all those contexts in mind, I look at Nowadays Theatre Company, co-founded by Atefeh and Mohammad Yagoubi, two Iranian Canadian theatre artists with substantial prior careers before rebuilding their work in Canada. Repositioned in Toronto in 2015-16, Aida and Mohammad have produced and staged more than 12 performances, some of which have been recognized by some of the Canadian Arts Council's festivals like Summer Works, Next Stage, and established presenters like the Krause Theatre that has been really tremendously important in their career. They also offer workshops and bilingual productions, both in English and Farsi. I look at this company in particular as it sits exactly at the intersection. There are some of the things that are like distorted. So, in the intersection I'm interested in, it's a company refounded after migration, but not by artists starting from scratch. It is bilingual, institutionally ambitious, and deeply shaped by negotiations around liminality of funding, venue access, professional legitimacy, and public visibility. So for me, the company is not just an example, it is a diagnostic case as well. Based on Mohammad's account and company's history materials that are derived from their websites, before migration, both Mohammad and Aida had already built substantial careers in Iran, as I said. Within the Iranian community, they are recognized as acclaimed, well-established theater artists whose works were widely watched and reviewed for being sociopolitically, in particular, sociopolitically rich and critical of the government. But they were actually forced to exile in 2015 after years of facing and challenging the state's oppression and censorship. The visuals that that I put together here show a parallel look at their capital in Iran. In each category, the upper bar shows their capital in Iran, and the one in the bottom in the Canadian context. They both arrived in Canada with 20 years of non-Canadian experience, with over 30 stage productions, all in Farsi, years of training, teaching, and leadership experience and professional recognition. In Bourdieu's terms, they were already carrying significant cultural, symbolic, and social capital. And we also have to have in mind that usually the professional trajectory goes from emerging to established. That's a normal process. But for those who immigrant, either artists or not, even for international students, the path reversed from established to emerging and then to established again. So one interesting thing to look at is the number of grants this little thing in the between, the number of grants they received in support of staging productions, showing half of the productions received grants from Canadian arts councils. And when we read this in the context of that pyramidal structure of theater market and the symbolic power which is at work within the funding structures, we can imagine how precarious the path should be for such artists with rich histories to stay visible in the markets in a new field, actually. An interesting thing to look at is all of those capital on the top would be translated into awards, honors, and grants in that category on the bottom. As you can see, all of that it's going to be translated into like 8 grants or 8 awards, which is kind of interesting to notice. And it's not actually exclusive to these artists. It's how the field actually works. So the issue here is not whether they were established artists. They were. The issue is that migration changed the field in which their capital had to operate. What the case suggests is that prior capital does not vanish, but it does not necessarily travel intact. And although these different forms of capital can be great resources or sources to rebuild professional trajectory, they may not be immediately available or converted into institutionally recognized values and habitus. Now let's take a look at some of the processes that I call conversion tests, through which prior experience is evaluated, translated, and either recognized or installed within a new institutional field for this particular company, and it can be also seen in other for other immigrant artists, whether from the Middle East or from elsewhere. The first conversion test is administrative literacy. One of the strongest parts of Muhammad's oral history is how much reentry involved learning systems that had very little to do with talent, with artistic talent or artistic creation itself. Resumes, portfolios, filling in applications, writing grants, and so on. I know many international students have been in there too. He talks about how even the idea of resume felt unfamiliar, and how strange it felt for him, especially as an established artist, because things are not happening in that way in Iran, that you don't need to bring resume as an established artist everywhere that you go. Everybody just knows you and you have your circle of networks. But here in this new context, it felt really challenging to him to describe himself professionally in the third person. He also had to learn English. Ida as well, as I've seen, she had to go to college to start over. And that is significant to look at that Dora Award nominee that she got like 3 years ago, knowing that she just started from scratch, I mean, linguistically even. He talks about how even the idea of, the next part I was gonna emphasize here. Yeah, he also had to learn English, Ida as well, ground language, applicant categories, documentation norms, and the formal structures that make an artist or a company readable within the Canadian field. And this matters because artistic reentry is not only aesthetic or cultural, it is also administrative. And what looks like a neutral process of professionalism is actually shaped by a specific institutional habitus. It rewards people who already know how to move through these systems sometimes. So the issue is not simply whether the system is open on paper, it is also whether artists have the support, language, and familiarity needed to become legible within it. The second conversion test, or the process that I'm gonna mention here, that I traced and I'm gonna mention here, is networking. Yagobi account, his account actually shows that entry into the field was not only about having a strong work, it was also about access to people who could help make that work visible and credible in a new context. He mentioned that he got early support from Sohail Parsa, whose Modern Times theater company is one of the most well-established Canadian companies, founded by an Iranian Canadian immigrant here in Canada. The early support from him, he was the one actually that he knew from Iran. They were friends, and somehow they met here in Canada. So he became the point of entry for Mohammed. And it mattered a lot because everybody knew him in the festivals, within the funding processes. And not only personally, but structurally, mattered a lot to Mohammed. It provided reference, orientation, and a first line of trust inside the Canadian theater ecology for him. And this is where social capital becomes especially visible in this case. His earlier reputation in Iran was important, but it did not circulate automatically in Toronto. It had to be reactivated through local introductions, festival entry, and new networks. And their first appearance nowadays, first appearance in Summer Books Festival, for example, as Mohammed mentions, mattered not simply as a performance venue, but as an entry infrastructure. It helps transform prior artistic value into forms that local fields could recognize, Canadian credits, local visibility, reviews, and eventually future successful applications. And this account echoes the data census materials that I reviewed, which identified mentorship, funding, and knowledge sharing as some of the strongest entry points for immigrant artists, and especially in Toronto's creative economy. So this case study is personal, but it also points to a wider structural pattern. Speaking of the census data that I reviewed, I traced certain shared patterns within the intercultural spaces and the arts. On the one hand, immigrants are clearly active in the arts. The data actually shows. In some surveys, foreign-born Canadians appear as highly engaged, present, and active participants in the arts. But at the same time, some reports show weaker sense of institutional belonging, lower representation in the arts leadership, lower median incomes, grant dependence or subsidy dependence, high urban cost pressure, and a lack of support structures especially for early and mid-career immigrant reentry. And that tension is important because it shows that participation should not be confused with equal access or equal convertibility. Immigrants may be visible or may be visibly present in the sector while still remaining structurally underrecognized within it. And that said, the third conversion test that can be identified within materials and within Mohammed's account is the money, time, and space. The case of nowadays theater speaks directly to the broader field conditions I mapped earlier, especially subsidy dependence, urban pressure, and time poverty. In his account, Mohammed comes back again and again to financial backing and challenges of securing grants for work so that he doesn't have to pay out of pocket, as he puts it. And at the same time, ensuring that everyone in his team, even the volunteers, gets paid an honorarium at least. And so grants are some of the resources to make that ethical collaboration possible at all. His account also shows how migration changes the temporal scale of theater making. In Iran, productions could run much longer and rehearsal processes could stretch over months until the director is happy with the final result. In Canada, especially for smaller scale companies, rehearsal periods are shorter and runs are more limited. And that shift affects income and the project's development, form, and experience of artistic work itself. And again, the case lines up with the broader data. High costs, unstable working conditions, and lower incomes are already shaping artistic labor across the field. And exilic artists often encounter those pressures even more sharply. And the last conversion test that I thought was worthy of mentioning here is venue attachment. Many small scale companies do not have any rehearsal or presenting spaces of their own, including nowadays theater. And I think the other two theater companies, the only one that I think among my research participants, the only one who that got space is Blackout Theater in Vancouver, and they have their own space. Even they run festival for immigrants, and they support immigrant artists. And I'm gonna interview them and see what is their processes of actually making that possible for them. What their capital has been. But in the case of nowadays theater, one of the structural problems that they face in the new field is that in grant application processes, arts councils support for staging often depends on already having a venue secured. So a circular logic emerges here. A project needs a venue in order to gain recognition, but access to a venue often depends on prior recognition. In other words, for a funding body to recognize you, you often need to have already been recognized by a presenter, another institution. And for a presenter to see you as presentable or marketable, your grant history, your grant history and how many grants you've taken really matters, especially the Canadian Arts Council's grants. And that is why I treat venue attachment and venue gatekeeping as more than a logistical issue. It becomes a mechanism of symbolic power. It acts as a kind of institutional shorthand to be taken seriously in the market. And that matters because access to venue attachment is unevenly distributed. Usually artists and companies, based on the data that I reviewed, the artists and companies who already have proximity to presenters, seasons, and established institutions appear more feasible before the work is even assessed on its own. So again, what nowadays the theater highlights is that artistic legitimacy is not distributed only through merit. It is also mediated through institutional closeness. I think I'm gonna pass this slide about the company's bilingualism. So the journey of nowadays theater from being established elsewhere to emerging in Canada shows that movement through intercultural theater spaces within the pyramidal structure of the professional theater field is rarely linear or equal. Even within these asymmetrical conditions, immigrant artists can gradually convert parts of their prior capital into new forms of recognition. through grants, festival presentations, networking, community visibility, and collaborations with established artists and institutions. Nowadays, theater in the Canadian context has moved from survival towards a more sustained mode of artistic production, with 12 productions on Canadian stages. It has become one of the most recognized companies within the Iranian Canadian diaspora in Toronto, and broader established Canadian theater presenters like the Krause Theater. Yet that movement has remained uneven, conditional, and never guaranteed. Many immigrant artists like Mohammed and Ida embody a contested form of emergence as a liminal space produced by institutions. Nowadays, theater shows how artists can arrive with rich prior histories and still be made to pass through a new tests of recognition before that history begins to count again. And this is why I describe emergence here as administrative rather than simply developmental. It is shaped through documentation, references, venue attachments, presenter trust, peer assessment, and the larger classificatory systems that organize artistic value. And the company enters the field with history, but not with equal legibility. What immigration actually interrupts is not necessarily artistic capacity, but the ways it is translated. And in that sense, conversion labor becomes an ongoing part of the creative process. I want to close by briefly turning to what this case suggests moving forward. If administrative emergence is institutionally produced, then the response cannot be reduced to telling immigrants to fit better or to adapt better. The issue is structural, so at least part of the response also has to be structural. And the case points to the importance of support for administrative literacy, grant navigation, and mentorship, something that I also traced in those data materials, especially for mid-career immigrant artists or early career immigrant artists who arrive with deep experience, but without the local infrastructures that make that experience legible. It also points to the need for more serious attention to venue access, since venue proximity plays such a large role in converting artistic work into institutional credibility. Just as importantly, the case suggests that immigrant artists need to be recognized more clearly within the data and policy frameworks that shape the arts sector as well. And their presence is visible in the workforce. Their presence is visible in the workforce, but their specific conditions of reentry are still not described with enough precision. So one of the broader implications here is that what it's needed is not simply more inclusion rhetoric, but better alignments between institutional decision and the actual conditions under which immigrant artists' artistic lives are rebuilt, actually. And I would like to end this with my heartfelt thank you to CFGS board and community for supporting my research. As I said, some of the field work that I just finished last semester in Toronto and Vancouver and Calgary were tremendously informing my research, and it wouldn't have been possible without your support. I'm also very grateful to my community members, and I'm happy to share that I'm currently co-editing a publication that will hopefully come up like next year, I think. It's a Routledge companion to language revitalization through the arts that I'm so excited to share with you when it's coming out. And thank you so much for listening from you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matthew, for your presentation. I want to commend you for a really well-structured research question and sub-questions, and your argument very clear. Thank you for that. I've been interested for quite a while in the arts capacity for truth telling in the aftermath of violence.
Yeah.
And so I'm finding some specific points that I'd like to ask you about. But before I go into that, I'm reflecting on, so before coming to CFGS, I lived in Montreal for over 20 years. And one of the things that I loved about Montreal was the accessibility of the public arts. It was everywhere, it was all the time, it was free or very inexpensive, it was just really accessible. And coming out to BC, I missed that. And so I wonder too, if what these communities, these artists are facing is they're coming into a culture that doesn't have the support that they would find elsewhere. So if you were to add a fourth study, if you could add one in Quebec, it would be interesting to see if with those additional funding venues and just the cultural background that supports the arts, you might find something.
I'd love to.
Different.
Yeah, totally. I could even see that. Sorry, before you move forward with your next question, I could totally see that when I went to Toronto. It was my first time there, and I could see the difference between the art spaces, like the communities there, and even the I mean the multiplicity of artists and even audiences. I could see the kind of in those multicultural spaces. It was different. Yeah, it was so lively, and I could see the difference. Yeah.
So in your argument, I think you make a very convincing argument that here you have experienced artists coming to Canada, being almost infantilized, right? Because their previous experience is not being recognized, and then they're having to rebuild, not entirely from scratch, because they have those previous tools, but they're categorized as emergent. And I think you're developing a model here that might actually track well with other professionals as they come to Canada. This sort of this facing of, and so emergent takes on kind of this interesting connotations and tones that I think that you're picking up nicely. I'll leave it there, but I have a lot of questions.
Yeah, totally. It can be extended to many professions and experiences. Absolutely. Yeah, thank you. Yes.
Well, thank you very much. As Cynthia saying, I really loved just the images, the way you organized your the slide deck, whatever you use, really very nicely done. I also, as Cynthia was saying, I'm more familiar with I have a strong kind of musical family, and I'm aware of the similar situation with musicians who come from other parts of the world, and some of them manage and some of them don't. I have a question, but the other thing that in my world, which is knowledge, democracy, democratization of knowledge, so and I think that what you've got, I think that another way of presenting this story and why it's important is around that decolonization of knowledge. Now we think about it a lot of the time here in BC. When we think of decolonization, we think of indigenizing, access to and understanding and, and all of that. But if you think about decolonization of knowledge in the fullest form, it really is about knowledge systems from the whole world, from all peoples, Persian peoples, 2,500 years of Persian theater, and theater is another form, as you were saying, of truth telling. It's another form of knowledge curation, knowledge creation, knowledge. So I think there's sometime if you're doing somebody asks you to do an article and you in that decolonial kind of discourse, you've got some good material for that. My question is a more practical one is, but let's say you're now in charge of the Canada Council for the Arts. What to do? What to do?
So based on thank you so much, especially for the suggestion about decolonial knowledge. Absolutely, path actually to go and add about the processes of funding allocation. Based on the resources that I read, and I haven't been there, I didn't do the field work myself, but based on the field work that particular scholar did, I think there are committees in Arts Council, jurors, usually like 3-4 jurors, who decide in a comparative way what works come below upper one another. And I think what can be done about it is just to bring more voices from community members. And I know that in some of these processes, they consider surveys, census data, like many of the materials that I also reviewed in my research. But the challenge is in some of these materials, these surveys or questionnaires, I could even see that some of the racialized communities were not even well categorized. Even for me as an Iranian, when I looked at visible minority communities, I couldn't see exactly where I could be seated or could be categorized in those. They usually make a distinction between Chinese, Korean, and Japanese for East Asia, but in those categories, there's just like without mentioning a specific community, you cannot find yourself within as a kind of distinguished identity. So I thought maybe that's something that I wanted to propose, better categorization, because those material really inform those community members in the funding processes. And some other thing that I remember was missing and that I somehow got blank. Beside that, there was something I wanted to add and I got blank. It was categories. I may come back to it again, but there are like gaps in those materials that I could identify. I think the more community members included in those materials, the more they can have a voice in those processes. Because, as I said, it's a liminal process. The government has its own voice. They are so concerned about what projects are economically, presentable. But community members also have their own voice, and there should be like a better balance. One practical way is just more precise or more inclusive forms of bringing voices from community, especially immigrant artists. On something I remember, it was that, as I said, like application writing assistance processes is something that I looked at, and in those there are resources for certain communities to get support for application writing, and but within those data that I reviewed, there were some communities mentioned and some not. So it was exclusively to indigenous and people with disability, but no immigrants were missing, absolutely. And I was like, absolutely, those communities should be acknowledged, of course, but there are some other communities who also need that level of assistance in language and translation and application process, because even for as an international student, I've been there, I know it's another world of learning. I had to go to a clinic tax at UVic to fill in my tax form the first time. I had no idea what those.
Same here.
I'm starting to need those myself.
Gonna say Canadians don't.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was lovely.
Yeah, Matt, go ahead.
Thanks, Cynthia. Thank you so much, Hanti. It's so fascinating to learn more from your project from our last conversation. I'm personally actually studying legitimacy and authenticity, but from the perspective of organization. So maybe we can talk more, but I'm going to raise 2 points. Yeah. So I don't know, in your view, do you really need to make theoretical contributions to the current literature? So if the answer is yes, I'd like to ask you what is actually new. because I see from what Bourdieu and then Baba and then Foucault, for example, Bourdieu talk about the social capital. In my readings of that classical work, social capital is historically, culturally situated, right? If you move to a different institutional environment, you seems to start accumulated from the very beginning. And I think it's not just the artist in your field. Even the doctor, my neighbor, he also have to start from scratch. He's a doctor in his home country. Even me, I come here and have to have the reference letters just to rent a house. How could it work in, it's so different, right? So I see the challenges you raised there, at least 3 or 4 there about the venue, about the money, and then the networks. I think it is generalizable. It is applicable across different fields. So I just wonder could be new theoretically. Yeah.
We are not supposed to, in our fields or in our department, we are not supposed, we are not expected to propose a new theory. But I would love to hear more from you in our chats, and I'm sure it's going to be many about what other trajectories and paths that I may not be aware of, and that can lead to a new understanding of how those theories can be implemented in not even theater, but also generalized to many other spaces. Absolutely.
Then the second point is that you raised in the research question, which seems to be really ambitious. I appreciate that. But you mentioned 2 key terms, like to me, it's fascinating because you put it there, legitimacy and authenticity. I don't know whether you see as tension, but to me, it's kind of tension. It's kind of paradoxal, right? If it's kind of the hipster paradox, you need to be recognized in the mainstream, but you want to be different. If you try to be legitimate the whole time, you lose who you are, right? What makes you distinctive? So maybe there could be the case whether we can further explore. So how could they overcome that paradox after they gain legitimacy? Because legitimacy to me is not a property. You cannot get it for one shot per time, but you have to continuously iterative renew it, right? So after get legitimacy, how do they maintain or better promote their authenticity? And how do that play out over time?
That's actually a very good point, and it's part of the conversation for my second chapter, which is actually about then when these artists come to the market and they navigating the ways of legitimacy and authenticity, and the authenticity specifically goes to how they represent their identities, and how they have to navigate like very contested area of what they are expected to present, especially as as Middle Eastern artists, because usually they have to navigate many stereotypes coming from media, coming from preconceptions. So the way they present their identities actually speaks to how much they want to stay authentic to themselves as a singular artist, as a distinguished artist, and how they want to be, somehow seem marketable for certain audiences.
Exactly.
Like really. So that's the kind of thing that I want to explore in the second chapter. That's why I did the field work and in these cities, because I had to watch some of the productions of these artists, the places they were producing their works, and the time they had to spend with their team, and actually I watched 2 of their productions, like three I can say, I really wanted to see how those productions were received by audiences. Who were audiences, how they are different from BC and in different provinces. So that was something that I look forward to explore. And thank you so much for adding to it somehow. Look forward to more conversations.
Sure. Can you write a paper on that?
Sure.
Sarah, then I think there's some other questions to go, so I can.
Thank you so much for your talk, Atefeh. It was fantastic to hear more in so much more depth than we've been able to talk about in our office. But I did want to ask about a kind of larger context of funding, because from what I know, and you probably know this way more in regards to theater performance, but that heritage and culture funding in Canada is kind of in a precarious spot, particularly
Yeah.
over the last year. So I'm wondering if that has been a sort of novel challenge for your research, if you've been reading quite a few federal budgets or responses to that to see impact on theater funding, because there are like, you know, the 15% rollback in budgets for certain ministries is kind of widespread. So I'm wondering about how that's impacting kind of that institutional context or maybe a little bit higher up. If that's a sort of
That's
challenge.
very interesting, Sarah, and I look forward to speak with you about that, because I know you have you also have some certain knowledge about that space. I looked at councils specifically. That's the first point of entry that these artists reach out to. Usually, it's more accessible for these artists at the same time that it has like the train is very uneven for them. But this is the main accessible source that they reach out, and they usually get, I mean, if they are lucky, they get funding for their production. So that in the conversations that I had with these artists, they never mentioned that source of funding, which is interesting that you brought this. And I think I need to make it, you know, a deeper research into that source of funding as well. Because usually the materials that I reviewed were basically based on Arts Councils as the main source of funding for theater artists. But absolutely, I have to look into that even more and see how those policies, even from a higher, I think, space, would affect even arts councils, and the whole process, how they affect these artists. But it's a good point, I think, to
Sometimes
dig more.
associations will have like a response to a
Yeah,
budget too,
yeah,
which might be
totally.
a good place to start to kind of.
Absolutely,
summarize it.
yeah, that's an ongoing process. This research is not finished yet, and it's not going to be finished. And I look forward to add more to it. And it's great opportunities to hear from different perspectives and bring more into it. And so grateful. Thank you.
So, another question? Yeah. Sorry, you go ahead and then.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Be nice, okay.
Thank you. Thank you. Just remembering how it started and how it's, thank you so much. It's beautiful. What I was thinking is the policy, the structure, how, you know, just coming here as a dentist and I couldn't practice dentistry because it was so hard. And I was just looking how similar it is. And being in the Turkish group and just looking at the WhatsApp notes, and you know, people are, it's, for example, after the earthquake, how people have immigrated in the last few years, and all they are talking about is like, I have this much experience and all these different careers. And also I was referring to my heart was so much in the indigenous homeless people when I was living in Vancouver, and I tried to help out. And you know, I took a course in public health to see what was going on, and I learned that like for that there are so many policies around that. If a homeless need on the street, if they don't have an address, they can't really apply for like food bank or something like that. So I was just thinking, combining all those, it may be an interesting question maybe in your research, like, you know, does it apply to others? So it's a general right system, and it just made me feel very
totally. It's something that has to be acknowledged in such a work, because this is not only exclusive to artists or immigrant artists. It's something that that I happen to you know, look at from theater, but I know as an international student, I've been there, and I know it's not inclusive to that is not exclusive to theater artists, and I would absolutely you know, include this, at least acknowledge that these are like spaces that can be faced by many different, in many different communities and in many different professions as well.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I'm also bringing it back to in my mind, when the system is so rigid, then there's no voice of the other.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it is also the oppression
Absolutely.
theory that comes into
Yeah.
the picture.
I
you know.
feel you, and I've been there, and what I came to my mind as you said that was the application for shirk funding.
Right.
As an international student, you are not, you have to have permanent residency, and you cannot have permanent
Right.
residency until you get your candidacy as a PhD, and you see what long way you have to go from the start to candidacy, to pass the candidacy, and then to apply for
Yeah.
shirk funding. For me, with COVID, between that process, by the time I got my permanent residency, I had passed my 4th year program, and I couldn't apply for a shirk anymore.
Mhm.
And you know, that was something that, you know, it was what it was, but you know, I felt it with lived experience,
Mhm.
really.
Was in
Yeah.
the same situation.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So there was the
So
only resource was Vanier scholarship, and I think even for
Yeah,
that,
you don't get
your
it.
department had to nominate you.
Nominate
I
you.
got the nomination. for
And
that.
they have priorities every year. So when
yeah.
I was eligible, it was STEM.
So yeah.
Social sciences out of the picture.
Yeah.
anyways, so.
I even got I got a nomination for Vanier from the department, and but it was too early for me. I was like too emerging a scholar. I had, you know, I just started to think about the research project. If I was like now, I could apply like with more confidence, but I applied and I never get it. So that's the part of the precarious path that we have all been in. So great to hear like multiple voices that echo this.
Yeah.
To feel that you're not alone in this, and these artists are not alone.
I think it is catch-22, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your presentation. That was really interesting.
Thank you.
And I come from an academia that I love Bourdieu, and I never heard anyone presenting or using Bourdieu that way, and I found it really fascinating. So it's, yeah. And one thing I was wondering is to what extent was intentional your choice to not talk so much about what is the artist saying, or what is the content of the art. And I'm wondering this because, as Mark hinted, the way capitals are received, understood, appreciated depend on what is the context, and sometimes moving from a different social field to one another that are appreciated the same way. And I feel like artists, because they have a voice, because they provide so much content, like part of the thing that makes them appreciated or not is what is the content of their art, what are they saying. And so I was wondering if you just didn't want to talk about that to shed light on the institutional processes,
Yeah.
or if, yeah,
So the question is how whether or not I wanted to include their works as well in this particular chapter or not, right?
yeah,
So what this chapter was basically more theoretical and like looking at policies and stuff, but I've in my mind I tried what I plan is to have more of their work in the 2nd and 3rd chapter, and that's why for the 2nd chapter that I have it like wait, it's not, no, I don't need it. In the 2nd chapter, thank you, yeah. In the 2nd chapter and 3rd, I'm gonna have a comparative case study, like looking at at least two theater companies, especially in chapter 2, and looking at their productions, in fact. And that's why I had to go to Toronto to see some of their recent productions in order to see how they present their identities within their works, what images they use, what context they use, what's the context of those topics that they choose for their works, and why. Is it based on the audience expectations, or is it something that comes from their lived experience? What are the challenges? Yeah, absolutely. My plan has been to include their work, because I think part of who you are as an artist is through your work, and it cannot be like excluded from my research. But for this particular one, I just looked at basically the limitation of my research was to just look at the path that they took, mentioning some of the work that they've had, but not in depth but in chapter 2 and 3, of course. And I look forward to that. Thank you so much for bringing that insights. Thank you.
Any last question?
Yeah.
If not, I'll ask.
I have one more.
Oh, you do? Okay.
Yeah, just building on what you said about living in Montreal. And Montreal, when I lived in Montreal, I didn't feel like I was living the idea that I had for Canada. It didn't feel like Canada. So the culture was extremely different. And I was just wondering, how would that be? Because if you are going to generalize it to Canada,
Yeah.
just a question mark there, because arts, culture,
Yeah.
and also the population, the immigration policies.
Oh, yeah, it's
There
not
are
a
different
unified
groups of
place.
people
Absolutely.
who come to Montreal.
Yeah,
and
that's a good point. I should
it's
acknowledge.
very interesting
Totally,
to
totally.
acknowledge that.
Yeah, totally. And I absolutely should be mindful of that because it's not a unified space. As much as the Middle East itself is not a unified space,
Right.
and all these communities and cultures are in there, and you cannot say this is the Middle East, and same way you cannot say this is Canada.
Yeah.
Sometimes when you say Canada's theater market, this is the kind
Yeah.
of contested term because you know what it is.
Yeah, even in Saskatchewan it differs, right?
Absolutely,
So it's
absolutely.
very
That's what I saw. Like I
Very.
said, when I went to Toronto to that distillery area where more grassroots companies and presenters are located. Watching at the performance that Ahmad Monica is also a musician, a great Arabic jazz musician. And I felt so lucky to have known him. He had his performance in there, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is so different from what I saw in the free.
Yeah.
Even the audience, they were so young and so diversified, and then they're so lively, and the space itself reminded me of Iran back home, which my favorite place to be was to be in theaters. I mean, in Tehran, especially where I had my and I had my BA and my MA, and there are lots of great theaters, and especially the audiences and the communities there are so lively, and it reminded me of that, and that's how different it was, and totally to acknowledge diversity, like the communities.
Yeah.
That's that last point about music made me think, because there's this key thing about how important is language in the immigrant experience, right? But theater or music, the international language, so
Yeah,
maybe there's something in there comparison wise.
yeah, totally.
Arranging playwrights and actors versus musicians as immigrants.
Yeah, it actually interesting to look at when I'm gonna look at Ahmad Monica, the Iraqi Canadian artist. That's a good question to ask because I think in his narrative, I could see that he came to Canada as an actor, theater performer, and his family, his dad has been like a very well-established artist, and he had his family always as a kind of social capital. Everybody knew him in Iraq, and because of what happened there, he came to Canada to for his kind of movie premiere, I think so, and he had to stay here as a refugee, and then he never thought that he could like be a musician as a kind of to take this as a profession, but the precarious path that he took here in Canada, it was so, the process made it so difficult for him to present himself as a performer first. So he used his music background as a kind of cultural capital, and he met with few friends and who were not friends first, but they were playing in the streets, and he met them, and then makes a band even from those meetings, and then they are like now very successful in Toronto. They're called Mosquito Bands, and they had like their tour recently in BC as well. And so that was interesting thing to me to look at as well, as you said, that for some musicians, immigrant musicians as well, the path is not that easy, but although the music is the kind of international global language. But that was interesting to me that he found that path easier as that kind of entry point than theater. And that's a good maybe place to start, you know, reading his case as well. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Auntie, for your presentation. We look forward to the dissertation. I think your times are very
Thank you so much for the space and the opportunity. I feel always safe and so happy here. So it's a privilege for me to present and to hear your feedback. Thank you.